Welcome back, everyone, to Afrodo's Reviews. And on this channel, I help you decide. Is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? That's what we're here to decide. Well, what I'm here to decide. They're just here to bother me while I record these videos. Dead Silence is a science fiction horror novel published on February 8th of 2022 by author S.A. Barnes. Now, S.A. Barnes may not sound very familiar, at least not on this channel, but actually not even really in general, but not the point here. This is actually a pseudonym for the author Stacey Kaede, who has written a number of other novels in the Disney Hyperion Publishing Company. Now, I can't say I've actually read any of those novels, but based on a cursory glance at her bibliography, the pen name S.A. Barnes seems to be mostly reserved for the horror novels that she writes, while the Stacey Kaede name is typically reserved for the more romance-centric books that she has. This will come up a little bit later, but keep that in mind. In any case, the book Dead Silence was nominated for a series of awards, such as the Goodreads Choice of Science Fiction Award in 2022, the ALA Alex Award in 2023, and the RUSA Codes Reading List, I don't know if it's Codes or CODES, Reading List for Horror in 2023. As far as I can tell, however, none of these nominations actually resulted in an actual award, but it is notable that they were nominated. That being said, there's really not much else to say about this book, so yeah, rating card. And now we move on to the cover. Now, being a Kindle book, I obviously don't have a physical copy of this to show off, so the cover is going to be right there. But the cover of this book is, yeah, pretty good. It's actually what drew me into this book in the first place. It has a nice use of colors. Really, you guys? It has a nice use of colors that bring to mind horror, along with that single hand slapping in what is clearly a porthole window on a spaceship. It sells the tone and setting immediately. It's a pretty good cover, all things considered. Which... No, not that. That's not what I'm talking about. Which... come to think of it, is starting to be something of a trend, but you'll know, I'll get a little more into that later. I don't have much else to say on this front, otherwise it's just a good cover. So let's go ahead and move on to the synopsis. Now, the synopsis as presented on the Goodreads website is: a woman and her crew board a decades-lost luxury cruiser and find the wreckage of a nightmare that hasn't yet ended. A ghost ship, a salvage crew, unspeakable horrors. Claire Kovalik is days away from being unemployed, made obsolete, when her beacon repair crew picks up a strange distress signal. With nothing to lose and no desire to return to Earth, Claire and her team decide to investigate. What they find at the other end of the signal is a shock. The Aurora, a famous luxury space liner that vanished on its maiden tour of the solar system more than 20 years ago. A salvage claim like this could set Claire and her crew up for life. But a quick trip through the Aurora reveals something isn't right. Whispers in the dark, flickers of movement, words scrawled in blood. Claire must fight to hold on to her sanity and find out what really happened on the Aurora before she and her crew meet the same ghastly fate. So the synopsis kind of flat out lies to you. Okay, so it's not that it's lying to you, it's just not telling you the truth, if that really makes sense. It's hard to explain why without really delving into heavy on the spoilers. But let's just say that what the story claims it's about is really only kind of relevant during the first half of the story. The second half of the story could have a completely different synopsis entirely. But I'm definitely going to dive more into that when it comes to the review. And what do you know? We're at the question. What did I think of this book?
It's just bad.
Okay, so that's not a fair assessment because when I first started this book, I did really like it. It was an interesting tale, and the mystery of what happened on the Aurora and what was happening to Claire and her team kept me invested. the book really gave me strong Dead Space vibes. Honestly, it gave me such strong vibes that I was starting to think it was less inspired by Dead Space and more just inspired by Dead Space sort of book. But it was still very interesting. There was a mystery, and watching Claire and her team deal with the oncoming madness while trying to investigate this mystery was really interesting. Except the story fails to deliver on me. Well, the story fails to deliver for me on many of the points that it initially set up. For example, Claire's team. I feel like I was just barely getting to know them when they're suddenly out of the book effectively. One of the things that makes an effective horror story is seeing characters you actually know well and like dealing with terrible things. Yes, there is always that asshole in every horror story, but for the most part, what makes horror effective is seeing people we can actually identify with succumbing to the terrors within the story itself. It doesn't really work if everyone there you just kind of want to die, otherwise you're rooting for the killer. It's the reason why something like Andrew Joseph White's Hell Followed With Us or Stephen King's Christine works so well, because we sympathize with the main characters. We don't want to see Benji or Arnie Cunningham or Dennis Gilder or any of those characters actually suffer and die. We want to see them triumph. We want to see them reach their happy ending. But the horror of the story makes us question, is that possible? And because we know them so well, actually seeing them die, even if they are bad people, means it's all the more scary when it does happen. Claire's team, on the other hand, well, they're not really fleshed out enough for me to care or to be happy or feel sad if they're dead. Kane is more or less just the understanding love interest, and there's little else to his character. Bowler is your traditional asshole character, but shockingly, he's the only one with personality. And Nisus and Lords? Honestly, couldn't tell you anything about them. At one point, I thought, maybe the author's hinting that Lords has a crush on Claire, or sees Claire sort of like a mother figure, or has a bit of hero worship for her. I don't really know to what extent that Lords was looking up to Claire, but that dynamic is never explored, because the second things start to go wrong for the team, well, we'll come back to this when we get to the spoiler section. In addition, I also found it really hard to like Claire Kovalik, our main character. She is the most fleshed out character, but I gotta be honest with you, if victim blaming and self-loathing had a poster child, Claire Kovalik is it. Claire takes every possibility to blame herself for every single tragedy and fault that occurs over the course of the book. And trust me, even if that does sound like a good character, it gets exhausting fast. By page 31, I have a note in my phone that asks just how many times the character has specified that she has a fear of relationships, because the last tangible relationship she had was on her colony, which was wiped out by a disease, because, she accidentally broke a quarantine on something and got everyone killed. Therefore, she doesn't get into relationships because she fears that if she loses everyone else again, she won't be able to handle the mental strain. Page 31, I must have read that line 5 times. I got it. At that point, I understood. You can stop bringing it up, Claire. Another complaint I would have in this non-spoiler section that I really can't lay out for you guys is something weird that this book does to try to emphasize its world building. Throughout the book, it really tries to remind you that this is a sci-fi setting. It's set in the far future. I think 2139 was the year it gave me. But in doing so, it does it in like a really weird way. And it mostly does that by consistently telling you that modern day terms are outdated. But I wouldn't be a pedantic YouTuber if I didn't tell you it doesn't make sense, because all it does is make me wonder, wait, why are these words outdated? Like the term black box. At one point, Claire notes that the term black box is an antiquated term, but it works for this instant, except why is it antiquated? What is the replacement word now? Black box has already been around for about 100 years as of my recording. So it's not like the word didn't have staying power, and it's definitely more of a term referring to something in concept rather than anything in specific now. This is one of those things that is not really needed to sell that this takes place in the future. It feels like it was included either to say, remember guys, this is the future. At a point that it's already been very well established, it's the future. Or it's constantly being brought up because the author wants to say, hey, I know this is a sci-fi setting, but my sci-fi setting is different than all those other sci-fi settings. Yeah. It's awesome, isn't it? And that's not the only word it does it for. For example, at one point, Claire is watching a video taken from before the aurora went dark and went missing. And the guy shooting the video idly tells the cameraman, keep rolling. And once more, Claire makes a point of mentally noting that it's an antiquated term, but again, why? Why is that term antiquated? What has replaced it? Or is this just another moment where the author just wants to say, to really emphasize my point, just remember, the term an eye for an eye was first used in the Code of Hammurabi in 1750 BCE. And we still use it today regularly. Sayings that have a lot of applicability have a way of sticking around a lot longer than I think the author is giving it credit for. But that's all small potatoes. No, the real problem with this book, I think, comes into the latter half of the book. And because of that, from here, I really do need to give a general spoiler warning involving this book. I will be spoiling this book from this point on. And if you don't want that, please go ahead and skip to the conclusion. I personally don't think the story is worth going into blind, as I think you'll go in with the wrong expectations and it will ultimately make the book a much worse experience for you. But I understand the desire to go in blind. So take of this what you will. Alright, so let's get this out of the way. The synopsis of the book flat out lies to you. The first half of the book is described a lot like Dead Space, and I won't lie, the synopsis does describe that section fairly accurately. In fact, it describes it so well, it kind of just makes the first point not reading. The first half of the book is described a lot like Dead Space, and much of the early mystery seems to be angling toward that way. What thing occurred that wiped out all the Aurora's passengers? What caused them to go mad? And the ship to be lost? And is it now affecting Claire's crew? Can she keep them alive long enough to make it out, or even solve the mystery? Well, no. Right away, the framing device spoils to you that most of her crew's dead. Yeah, the framing device of this book is actually Claire giving a recap of the events of what happened on the Aurora to a pair of suits in a corporation she worked for. Well, you know, the one in the beginning that's about to make her obsolete. Which are totally not Weyland-Yutani, by the way, guys. I don't know why you guys would say that. It's totally not Weyland-Yutani from the Alien franchise.
You were drifting away for a moment there, Mr. Clark. I believe you were telling me about your nightmares that you've been having. About your dead girlfriend. What was her...
Anyways, now, a framing device like this can work. Especially if you make Claire an unreliable narrator, whose word is always up for debate. Except it isn't. Her word is treated as true by the narrative, even when the narrative is giving the suits token moments where they question the reality of her story compared to what they can prove with the evidence they have. But the problem is they don't have enough evidence to throw into that much doubt her story. Nor can they really prove anything she says is a lie. Plus, since we're in Claire's head, literally seeing her point of view, we don't get any hints from her that she's seeing the story wrong. We don't get any hints from her that maybe something isn't quite adding up with my story. She is sure of her story the entire time. But worse yet, the framing device spoils most of the suspense of the story. Why? Because it flat out spells that almost all of Claire's crew died in the events of the Aurora. On page 47. Not even a quarter of the way through the book. And we already know that all of our crew is dead. Or at least most of the crew. And better yet, we even know how they died. So we don't even get that suspense. But don't worry, that's probably for the better. Because you see, the first half of the book is Dead Space. But the second half decides, you know what, I'm tired of that. We're aliens now.
One of those things managed to wipe out my entire crew in less than 24 hours.
Yeah, halfway through the book, the story just hard pivots on what it's ripping off. Again, the first half of the book reads like a group of spacefaring people going to a location, finding out that everyone was there killed by unknown circumstances, and struggling to learn all they can while trying to escape before they are killed too. With a strong theme of madness occurring and our main character being guided by loved ones that she knows is already dead, it's only a wonder what inspired the first book. Now, I've seen a lot of people say this reminds them of the first Alien movie, but I would argue that it's more Dead Space.
Things you didn't want to see.
It spoke to me.
What did it say, Isaac?
Then, halfway through the book, the story just suddenly says Claire somehow escaped right as things were getting intense during the Dead Space plotline. And she doesn't exactly remember how she escaped either, by the way. Also, that's never resolved. We don't actually know how she escaped. And her lone surviving crew member can only speculate why Claire left them all behind. And, from then on, we follow the story when obviously evil and corrupt corporation sends a group of trained military personnel to a location with the intent of destroying the thing there. Better yet, there's even a hard-knock Hispanic woman named Diaz who takes no shit from everyone else. And it turns out that the organization is actually responsible for all the bad things caused, and this is more or less just an attempt to clear their name while also getting their experiments back. Even apart from the fact that it's an obvious ripoff, changing midway through, the tonal shift from isolated madness horror to the evils of corporations in an action-packed moment is so jarring. I genuinely felt like I stumbled into another book. I took this book, which at this point I was still enjoying, and I wanted to drop it hard. Before I reached this point, I did have some critiques about it, but overall, I would have said this is a good book, and I do recommend it. After this point, and a funny thing too, another problem this creates. Do you notice how the two inspirations I've noted so far are monster horrors? Well, the funny thing is, by using these two as clear inspirations, is that it creates this weird sense of expectation that's never delivered on. Because you can so clearly see what the inspiration this author is using for these, I was expecting certain things to occur. For example, I thought Dead Silence was going to be a monster horror book most of the way through. That whatever was on the Aurora was actually a genuine monster, a genuine eldritch being causing these issues. Initially, I figured they'd get on and turn on the environmental controls only to find out the dead passengers would become their enemies, or it would unfreeze whatever was frozen in the cargo bay that did all this. But that didn't happen. Even if that didn't happen, though, I was still expecting some kind of threat, like some kind of abstract entity that causes madness. Maybe it's not even one the characters can fully understand. Think Color Out of Space. But no, there is never at any point a monster that exists outside the characters' own minds. Which is fine. Don't get me wrong. But because the author is drawing from sources which had monsters, and she doesn't change them enough to really make it feel like her own work, it felt like through most of the book there was still supposed to be a monster somewhere. Except when it gets to the revelation of what actually is causing all the madness. And it is just so anticlimactic and boring. And it even kind of opens up a plot hole. Now, by this point you must be asking me, well, what is causing all the madness then? If it's not a monster horror, clearly there must be something causing the madness, right? Well, you see, it turns out that the reason the people of the Aurora were driven mad to the point they either started to kill each other or themselves is because vibrations. So it turns out that the mother company of this whole thing, Weyland-Yutani, Verix, or at the time that the Aurora was sent out, City Futura, actually installed a device on board the Aurora that would put a near imperceptible tone throughout the vessel that would mess with people's heads. It wasn't meant to drive them insane, but it was meant to create irritability in them. Now, this promptly makes the most unbelievable part of this book not the idea that a space monster drives people insane with its mere presence, but the fact that a corporation would experiment on the rich upper crust and destroy their lucrative investments in the process. On purpose. But no. The real reason this doesn't make any sense is Claire is clearly not hallucinating. Now, throughout the book, Claire sees a number of hallucinations from people who have died. Initially, this is just hallucinations of people from her past or her crew popping up. Now, that works. That definitely can be described as an hallucination, and they are the most prominent, but here's a problem with how this is portrayed. Claire begins to see the ghost of people who she's never met before. At one point, while she's talking to one of the suits, a man named Reed, she sees the ghost of his grandfather behind him. Now, you might be able to excuse this one as maybe Claire was just taking in Reed's appearance and aging him up in her mind. She does describe him as an older looking Reed. And you can also excuse that with a lot of hospital patients. Maybe these hospital patients are just people she's imagining to be in there. They're not real people. Maybe someone she's seen on screen, or maybe a person she saw in the Aurora that she's now imagining is in the mental ward with her. Again, those all can be excused. Except, later on, when she's meeting with the Marines, she tries to talk to one only to find out, wait, he's already dead, and he's a man named McCoffey. Now, Claire in no way throughout the book had any indication she knew who this was, never met a man before the scene, never talked to any of these Marines before. And when she talks to one of the Marines about talking to McCoffey, who she thinks is right in front of her and alive, Diaz instantly reacts when Claire mentions who she's talking to, meaning McCoffey was a real guy. And it's confirmed later that he was in fact a real guy, a real leader, who died saving Diaz from a bomb on one of their last missions. Better yet, Claire sees him on Earth, not while she's on the Aurora, which means she's not being subjected to the hallucination vibrations. So how is Claire seeing people she's never met before? If this is all had a mundane scientific explanation, if it really wasn't a cosmic horror like The Marker or The Reapers, how is it doing this? With The Markers or The Reapers, you can excuse it. They're cosmic horror. There's a certain sense of magic to them, a certain sense of unknowing to them. Claire being able to see dead people that she never knew before, I could suspend my disbelief of while it was that. But the moment you throw in a mundane explanation, my suspension of disbelief goes from here to here, because now everything has to make sense. Furthermore, another plot hole is how fast the MAW, or the MAW is what it's called, device works changes depending on how the author needs it to. For example, the Aurora was on track for several days before things began to go wild, and people began to kill each other, meaning that the MAW took a while before it drove people to that level of insanity. And then Claire's crew gets on there, and they're there for about a day before the first person loses their mind, and
We're all gonna burn for what we did to you.
But then when the Marines get there, they're succumbing to madness like that. And that's before Claire cranks the MAW to max power. Which, okay, I'm not exactly sure on my science here, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but when you play a specific tune that's meant to induce madness, isn't it more about frequency than volume? Like, again, correct me if I'm wrong, and I really do mean this. But if a specific frequency is played that makes you go mad with prolonged exposure, would the loudness of it actually change anything? It's not actually. It shouldn't actually increase the speed in which the madness takes place, right? It just means you can't block it out as easily, right? That one I'm not sure about, but that's a question that made me ask. Again, it's not a cosmic threat where the closer you are to the source of madness drives you mad faster. It's just a regular old scientific invention. One that apparently can go through earplugs even before it was cranked high, making you wonder what the point of the earplugs were. Or why in the future they just don't have... Like, okay, so that's another plot hole. Verix knows what's on this, right? And they know they're sending a group of Marines in there. Even though they plan to kill a bunch of these Marines to sell their story, why didn't they outfit some of the Marines with just a flat-out frequency-canceling headphone? they know this is just a frequency, and in theory, they should know the exact frequency being played. So all they really have to do is, here's a frequency that cancels out this frequency so you don't go mad. And that would make sense. That would add a little more credence to the playing it louder, because then that frequency beats this frequency because it's louder. I would accept it more then, but that's not what happens. It's just earplugs. I'm surprised we didn't get a scene where it's like, earplugs is just an antiquated term. We call them whatever. It's just an antiquated term. I can't think of a good idea. But another thing is, the effects aren't permanent, as Kane is almost entirely fine by the end of the book, despite at one point having been driven so mad he goes into catatonic shock and can't do anything but drool all over himself. So I don't know. I cannot. I really wish I just had the perfect words to describe how disappointing the final half of this book is. It is so disappointing because it is just a different book altogether. And if the author wanted to do this as a sequel, that'd be one thing, because it really would be like Alien and then Aliens. It worked for a reason. But the problem is, it's not. The tonal whiplash is too great. The mundane explanation ruins a great part of the book. And the fact that you don't learn enough about Claire's crew to actually care that they died, despite the fact that the entire first half of the book is an isolated horror story based around madness with them. Overall, this book has a lot of disappointing reveals, failing to utilize its horror elements properly, and it doesn't even have interesting characters to boot on top of that. If you really want my opinion, I'm going to give this book a 4 out of 10. I think I honestly ranted enough about this book that I really don't have much else to say in this conclusion. It really is a very disappointing book. It is one of those books that the inspirations of it is so clear that it almost creates false expectations that the book itself never means to set up. And I brought that up. In addition, to expand a little more on my point earlier, a lot of people say that the first half of the book is Alien, which I will disagree with. I think the first half of the book, it really does feel a lot more like Dead Space. The madness theme, entering a ship where everyone's already dead, and not being able to determine why people are going mad all of a sudden. People just are going mad out of nowhere, and that's resulting in more loss of life. It makes a lot more sense if you think of it as Dead Space than Alien. I won't deny, though, that the second half is definitely Aliens, and honestly, the author should have at least made Diaz like someone else entirely, because so, just long story short, I really did not like this book. I think this book sets up a lot of false expectations it never delivers on. So I really don't recommend it. I don't think it's quite worthy of throwing into Mount Doom, to be completely honest, but it avoids it by just that much. It becomes very clear, I think, learning that the author wrote romance novels before this makes a lot of it make sense in hindsight, because it seemed like the story's a little more interested on the Claire Kane romance subplot than it was anything else about the book. It kept coming back to that. That was slowly becoming the crux of it. And even when Claire is thinking about her crew and leaving them behind, her focus was more on Kane than anyone else. She does, like, finding all the rest of the crew is treated like, oh, that sucks. But I don't see Kane here, so obviously things are still looking up. At the end of the day, again, I don't recommend this. And I don't know what it is. I don't know why there's like this trend where stories have like really good covers often end up being bad. Maybe it's a sense of false expectations I'm creating for myself. But with that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure. And every adventure is worth having. Even the bad ones. Even if sometimes I really wish I didn't have to say that. See you later, everyone.